Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Tore Olsson, who has written a book recently released called Red Dead's History. She is holding up, I don't know if you can see this, but he's holding it up in the camera right there. And of course, that's the topic of this week. We're going to discuss a video game, Red Dead Redemption 2. And I want to say you don't have to play the game to enjoy this episode. Just mainly going to talk about how to compare the game towards real life Wild West and talk about real history behind the Red Dead Redemption 2. And as well, you don't have to have played the game to enjoy the book because it's a very much Western book and it's such a fantastic book. And I'd rather say we need more books like this that take the history video games like this on the market because it should spark an interest in both Western history, or for example, Assassin's Creed world. I think we need more books like this because it's such a fantastic format and it might spark an interest. But like you said in the prologue of the book, this book has a rather interesting origin story in itself. So let's talk about how this book came about because that's in itself is really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, thank you, Erlend, for inviting me to join you. It's an honor and pleasure to be on your podcast. So my name is Tori Olson, and I'm a history professor at the University of Tennessee in the United States. But I am Swedish originally, as my name probably suggests, which is is a very Nordic sound to it.
I kind of guessed that when I saw the name of your name. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So we share a fellow Scandinavian connection in
maybe
that
distant
regard.
ancestors. Who knows?
Yeah, but I've lived in the United States for 34 years at this point, so I am very Americanized in many ways. And of course, I am a specialist at American history, which I teach at an American university now. So it's a little ironic to be sure. But the origins of this book, Red Dead's History, very much has its origins in the classroom. This began as an experiment in teaching and then became a book only later on. So I teach courses on modern US history basically since the Civil War at the University of Tennessee. And I've always used pop culture in my teaching a good bit. I use music and movies in my classes quite a bit. But before 2021, I had never tried using video games in the classroom. And I think the reason why is that I think video games still have a good bit of stigma in the academy as being as like a form of pop culture that's less serious and less highly regarded than television or literature or film or things like that. But I think that's something that we need to change our thinking on because gaming is obviously such a rapidly growing industry, which now in the United States earns more money than music and movies combined, which is pretty striking. And in many ways, I think I'm the perfect person to do so, to kind of use video games in the classroom, because I have a long history of playing video games myself. So when I was in high school in the 1990s, especially, I was a really, really obsessed and fascinated video gamer. It was like my favorite hobby. I did very little else other than play video games at this time. But when I got to university in 2000, I decided to quit. I realized that video games were not doing me any favors academically, and I really took 2 decades off from gaming. Really, 20 years passed by without me picking up a controller or a gaming laptop or PC or anything like that. So during those years, I was getting serious. I was going to college. I earned a PhD in American history, and I started work as a professor. And during all that time, I assumed that gaming was something of my history, but not part of my future. I assumed that it was sort of childhood fascination, but not something that I was going to do any of in the future. But the pandemic changed a lot of that because the pandemic, shifted our lives in such dramatic ways and locked us down at home with, many of our old hobbies being impossible. So I decided in 2020 to get back into gaming. just for fun, and it was did not have any professional pursuits in picking this up again at all. But one of the first games that I played was Red Dead Redemption 2, and I really came to it mainly because I heard it had great graphics and great storytelling, which is very true. It does have both of those things, to be certain. But I really did not pick it up because of its historical nature. In fact, I was probably reluctant to pick it up because of its historical nature, because very often, when video games do history, it's not always that impressive. It can be a little disappointing, especially when you're a professionally trained historian. But in playing Red Dead Redemption 2, I was pretty consistently surprised and impressed. Not that the game was teaching you the ins and outs of American history, but that it was frequently gesturing toward and kind of paying lip service to some of the biggest dilemmas in American history of this 1880s to 1920s moment that the games are set. So I saw enough sort of potential within the game that I believed it could be possible to teach a class uh, using the fictional content of the games as a way to explore the real and big and
Oh, I
real.
would love to be in
Uh,
that class for sure.
yeah, well, I was aware when I picked up the game, how popular it was. I knew that Rockstar Games in general made incredibly popular games, and I knew that there would be hundreds upon hundreds of students at my university and then millions elsewhere who loved this game and might be interested in using it in a sort of, learning fashion. So in the fall of 2021, I taught the world's first ever college history class on the Red Dead
That's
Redemption
amazing. That's amazing.
games. Yeah, and I was actually really surprised that I was the first to do it. I'm sure that other history professors have used the game in some way, but none had like designed a class around it. And of course, the class is not actually about the games. It's the games are a hook to get students excited. They are a sort of tool to bolster interest and passion and enthusiasm among the students, but the actual content of the game is not what I'm examining or teaching the students about. It's about what really happened in the American past and using the game as a way to get folks excited about it. But yeah, so this was a first. I'm, still surprised that I was the first one, given that the game was actually like almost 4 years old at the time when I taught the class, which is quite interesting.
Now, look, let's begin. Maybe not to follow your book precisely bit by bit, but let's begin with the gang itself, the Vanderline Gang, at the outbreak of a dying Wild West, and as they escape the law because of the Blackwater massacre at the colony. So, but let's it's not like you said, this is going to be about comparing, not unlike you said in the beginning, it's going to be about comparing the game and real life Western history of this era. But let's begin with talking about outlaws and gangs such as the Vanderling Gang we meet in this series. And let's talk about how the outlaw gangs in the 1899 as the 1890s as the game is set. So let's talk about the so-called end of the West of the Western. And I mean, believe we discussed this before in the previous with another just I had on that the West was really dying. As I say in the game, at that time it still took maybe another decade or two before it actually kind of died, that they were civilized. But let's kind of call it the dying of the decaying of the West, for lack of better words. And let's talk about gangs and outlaws in the 1890s.
Yeah. So I don't believe that there's a West that dies or
Mm,
fades. I think that is an
yeah.
invention of mythology and culture rather than history. And in fact, the very best scholarship on the history of the American West has really pushed back against this understanding that there's two halves of Western history, that there's a wild West and there's a tame West.
Mm.
I don't think that's the way to think about it. I think that there's a sort of pretty consistent through line of conquest, of kind of external forces seeking to impose their agenda upon this region that starts way before the 1800s and then continues way after the 1800s as well. I think a lot of our understanding of the supposed closing or waning of the West, which of course Red Dead Redemption 2, really builds upon, is really the product of this one essay by this very influential historian called Frederick Jackson Turner, who made this argument in 1893, a long time ago, who claimed that, the frontier era in American history was coming to an end in the 1890s. And he gives these pretty thin, not so convincing reasons why. And we've kind of like American pop culture as a whole has accepted this argument and said, this is a period that comes to an end, this kind of wild unsettledness. But there's so many examples later in the 20th century, even arguably into the 21st century, of chaotic, unsettled conditions resulting from this kind of external conquest of a region. I mean, just look at some of the mineral booms that take place in the 20th century. I mean, look at the sort of copper boom, the coal mining boom, look at the uranium mining boom in the West. All of these conditions, big companies coming from outside trying to extract wealth, they create these unsettled conditions. We have a lot of like men who don't know one another coming together in these towns that often get violent. These are things that happen for a very long time. So I actually think this is kind of my hot take. I'm not the only one to make this, but like the Wild West as an idea, it doesn't actually hold water historically. So the Wild West is not a phrase that I ever use in my book uncritically, because I don't think that it's actually supported by documented history. I think that there's been a lot of violence in the West throughout a long period of time, to be sure. But yeah, so outlaw gangs, that was your original question. Of course, the plot line of Red Dead Redemption 2 really focuses around this Vanderline gang, this kind of idealistic outlaw chief, Dutch Vanderland, and then his group of sort of followers. Particularly important, his kind of key lieutenant Arthur Morgan, who's much more down to earth and sort of jaded, as opposed to this dreamer, it's idealistic dreamer
But as
in
it keeps saying,
Dutch
he's not a
Vanderland.
good man.
Say it again.
As it keeps saying, he's not a good man.
Right, exactly. Um, Now, were there outlaw gangs in the West at this period? Yeah, absolutely. I think the very closest inspiration behind the Vanderland gang would have been Butch Cassidy and his Hole in the Wall gang, which were quite active in the 1880s and 1890s. And I have a whole chapter actually devoted to Butch Cassidy and his crew in the book, just because there's so many parallels, right? They're pursued by the Pinkertons. They robbed this major railroad in 1899 in Wyoming. They flee to Latin America, right, which the gang also does in the game. There's all sorts of parallels. I mean, I think the storyline of Red Dead Redemption 2 is probably built on a lot of Western movies, but I think the one movie and the one actual real life equivalent would be Butch Cassidy and this big movie that came out in 1969 with Robert Redford and Paul Newman.
But
But yeah,
as
no, go
sorry,
ahead.
as you point out, they actually don't really kill, because as point out a few times in the book as well, there's quite a high kill count in the game, and of course, without it, the game would be kind of boring. That right? It's a video game, so of course you're gonna, but the Wild West, so of course you're gonna kill kill a few people, NPCs in the game, but as you pointed out in the book, the Butch Cassidy doesn't actually really kill out someone, as far as you say, believe, until the end of his
Yeah,
life.
right, exactly. Yeah, the body counts in Red Dead Redemption 2 are bizarrely high. I mean, this is, it's to be expected in many ways. So I think you could have killed a third of that people and it would still have been a fun video game. I think it was a little over the top, their decision, but I know why they made that decision ultimately. But yeah, there's only a handful of, Western outlaws who even kill 10 people, right? So Arthur Morgan, under an honorable playthrough, kills a minimum of about 900 in Red Dead Redemption 2, right? So that's obviously grossly overinflated. But most of my book is actually not trying to tear down or, ridicule this
Mm.
game for its inaccuracy, because, that's not really my goal. My goal is more to explain the stuff that the
Yeah,
game mentions, but doesn't actually contextualize or unpack. So I'm much more interested in, kind of filling in the silences
mm,
and the gaps, where the game talks about, for example, the memory of the Civil War in the
yeah,
South. And they harp on this a couple times, but they don't really, they don't teach it. This is not an educational title. It is an entertainment title. But the fictional world of the game can be a really powerful way to actually engage the big ideas and dilemmas that made the US tick at this moment.
mm. Let's talk, I want to, before we go on to the next one, I want to talk about the first town that we enter into. And actually, before that, I want to point out that I'm sure you played Red Dead Online a little bit as well. And
A little bit, but not that much.
I'm sure that there's always one or two players there who keep killing other players and keep killing and massacring people, and they say, "Oh, it was the Wild West. People killed each other all the time." But actually, that's not really true. It wasn't like people massacred every town they came into, like say Valentine or any other Saint Denis or New Orleans. Let's talk a little bit about how, because from what I understand, it wasn't always that exciting. And we mentioned it before on the podcast. The reason we hear, for example, so much about duels, in the thought that they happened so much in the Middle Ages, but because they were written down when they happened, we think they happened quite a lot more than they actually did. So let's talk about a little bit of murder that we were onto about how common was it that actually people went into duels or shootouts in the Wild West.
Yeah. Yeah. The large majority of the West in the late 1800s was really quite peaceful and law-abiding. Uh, so, our any vision that presents, the entirety of the West, which is a massive place, right? And such a diverse place, so different in terms of ecologies and landscape. There's so many different places that come encompassed by quote unquote the West. But there were pockets that were unusually violent, right? So that there's a grain of truth that this mythology builds upon. There were places where body counts and um, homicide rates were quite high compared to the rest of the country and compared to what homicide rates look like today in the United States. And this tended to be in boom towns, in towns where the population grew very rapidly and where you had this really diverse stew of people, mainly men, like unaffiliated men coming together, who are there for, coal or, gold or ranching, like some sort of like extractive industry that brought a lot of people together, a lot of strangers together, right? So in those places where you had fewer women, you had thin legal structures governing society, there you would find a good deal of violence. I mean, it wasn't ridiculous. In the most violent towns, it was probably about twice as violent as the most violent cities in America today. Like if you look at, for example, the most violent cities in the US today, cities like St. Louis, Missouri, New Orleans, Louisiana, they have homicide rates of about 50 to 70 homicides per 100,000 people. And in some of these really violent boom towns in the West in the late 1800s, it'd probably be like 100 to 120 or so. So about double of what the kind of statistics are for today's most violent cities. And so that, that's pretty violent. That's a lot of bloodshed, to be sure. But it's not everywhere, to be sure. And what's interesting, like one of the probably the biggest argument of my book has to do with why. Like, why were people shooting at each other? That's a question that's rarely raised in Wild West mythology. And in the video games, the question of why is usually pretty personal. Like it's pretty random or personal, depending, that shapes factors that shape why folks are shooting each other in Red Dead 2. It's usually the individual pursuit of gain, like it's robberies, it's, holdups, or it's rivalries and grudges and, drinking too much whiskey. Those are the kinds of factors that quicken the trigger finger in Red Dead Redemption 2. And of course, it is true that those sorts of things also spurred violence in the West or the South or wherever in the late 1800s. But a lot of the violence that took place in America at the time was wrapped up with questions of politics and economics. A lot of people are fighting about big social dilemmas. They're not just fighting over, a woman that these two guys were both pursuing. They're not just fighting over poker games or some points of honor in a street side duel. That's a small part of it. The bigger story
But it
has to do with
happened.
it did happen, of course. I wouldn't deny that. And in some places, they might have been more so. But the big things that people were fighting about, as I foreground in the book, were questions about capitalism, particularly the rise of large corporations, which is really a new thing in America at that time, and then questions of race as well. And this is true in the West, but it's especially true in the South. And of course, let's remember that a large part of Red Dead Redemption 2 actually takes place in the Deep South, not just in the West. And in the South of the late 1800s, this is also a really violent place, but most of the fighting and the bloodshed has to do with questions of race, has to do with the unfulfilled promise of racial equality, which the US does put on paper as part of Reconstruction after the Civil War, but which is not fully fulfilled at all. So there's a great deal of grievance and contestation about race in the South, to be sure.
Mm. Now, of course, one of the early parts of the game you begin like with a train robbery, of course, and one of the rail barons that we rob is Leviticus Cornwall, and so let's talk a little bit
Yeah,
about the, and he's actually, like you say, a fairly re good representative of those, as you say, the big four. I don't know, it's
yeah,
four or five, big five in real world Western history. So let's talk about the real railroad barons and types like Leviticus Cornwall that we meet in the video game. That is one of the villains in the game. So let's talk about how the railroad come into the West and of course the tycoons of these products. That is said about capitalism and the new thing, and let's talk about
right.
one of the big ones in real history.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the Leviticus Cornwall character in Red Dead Redemption 2 because he's very much cut from real historical cloth. He was very much inspired by some of the larger than life sort of titans of industry that were transforming the United States in the decades after the Civil War. I see in him people like John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, Tom Scott, um, Andrew Carnegie, right? The list goes on. I mean, there's these men who many who come from very humble circumstances. They're not born rich, but through their good luck, through their connections, through their use of government assistance and benefit, they create these empires, these economic empires that really had never been seen before. I'm not saying that capitalism didn't exist in the US before the Civil War. That's obviously untrue. A lot of the US, like for example, the cotton economy based on slavery was deeply capitalist and was aimed to feed the large industrial mills of Europe, England, and France and Germany and places like that. But big scale vast bureaucratic corporations don't really exist until the 1870s, arguably the late 1860s. And the railroads are really the first ones. The railroads are the first modern business corporations in American history, in part because you had to have this huge bureaucratic structure in order to oversee a vast operation, like running trains on time across a continent. So the sort of the task of operating the railroads was the mother of invention that made a corporate capitalism come about. And in our lifetimes, a lot of Americans, at least, I can't speak for Norwegians, but a lot of Americans are sort of, they're used to living in the shadow of these massively powerful
Mm.
corporations, right? Today being Amazon,
Yeah,
Tesla, God
yeah.
knows what else,
They're
right?
here as well.
Walmart,
Yeah,
of
maybe not
course.
Walmart, but yeah, Tesla,
It's not so,
Amazon
it's
today.
not
Yeah.
that everyone loves them today, but they're kind of like familiar with them, and it's almost hard to
Yeah.
imagine a world without them. But in the 1870s and 1880s, those companies were new. They were really, really unprecedented, and a lot of Americans were deeply skeptical of their of their place in American society. They were really critical and saw them as a destruction, not just of economic sort of free opportunity, but of democracy as well. They thought that these big concentrations of money and power was going to destroy American democracy and the ability of kind of regular people to shape their government and their society. And
I mean, let's
you know
face it, they
what?
weren't
They
really
weren't
wrong
totally
though.
wrong. They weren't wrong at all. The way that money has entered politics, it
Mm.
certainly begins in this period. It wasn't the first time it did, but it became much more concentrated and pronounced. And
I want
so
to,
there's a lot of
if I may,
resistance, right?
if I interrupt you, what were the profit of building the railroad, and what were the economic advantages of being the one who built the railroad, and where were the profit in this?
Yeah. Well, early on, like in the 1860s, when this project begins, the first transcontinental railroads, there was not a lot of profit to be made because there wasn't a lot of demand for railroads. There was, in fact, minimal demand for railroads in the West because white English-speaking settlement was really, really low, and most of the native people or previous, Spanish speaking or French speaking inhabitants weren't interested in rail at that time. So the railroads really come too early. They're very much premature. And as a result, a lot of them economically do very badly in the first decades of their operation. There's a lot of evidence to show that this came way too soon. And if it had been delayed to, let's say, 1900 or so, the US economy would probably have developed in a more um, balanced and productive manner. So eventually, of course, the railroads become very, very important, not so much for moving people around, but for moving raw materials around, particularly Western resources, things like lumber, crops, animals, minerals that make a lot of money for folks back east. It's really the sort of industrial hub of the eastern seaboard that benefits the most from railroad construction in the West, right? Because most of the railroads are essentially sucking out resources from the West, leaving fairly little behind in exchange, and benefiting, places like New York and Boston and Philadelphia.
I want to talk a little bit about the next topic, and that is the philosophy of the Vanderline Gang, because they really kind of tried to defy the government and defy civilization, right? They want to live on their own terms, and kind of at least before we meet them in our storyline, they want to we're kind of this Robin Hood gang, where gave as they talked about in the jail, they gave to the rich and they gave sorry, they stole from the rich and they gave to the poor. That's what I meant to say. But was the kind of gangs like this that kind of had this philosophy of the Vanderline gang that kind of try to defy civilization or try to kind of wear a little bit Robin Hood type.
Yeah, right. So we can go back to that comparison with Butch
Mm.
Cassidy and his crew, in that they might have talked some of what of a sort of, let me put it this way. Both the Hole in the Wall gang and the Vanderland gang were ultimately self-seeking, right? I mean, like their talk of idealistic, Robin Hood, social banditry is really a cover for enriching themselves. I mean, I think that Dutch Vanderland talks about him, as a sort of redistributionary, messiah. But that in practice, that's not how he operates. It's much more self-serving, personal enrichment as the goal. Now, I should say, if if the Vanderlyn gang was truly committed to social leveling of some sort of sort, of, taking from the rich and giving to the poor, then they would have had political identities. And they would have been partisan in their beliefs. But party politics is something that is completely absent from Red Dead Redemption 2. And this is rather funny because Americans in the 1890s were incredibly partisan. They were very firmly, committed to one party or another. And there's really kind of, there's the Democrats and Republicans, but then there's also the
Mm.
populists, this third party movement, which was gaining quite a bit of steam in the 1880s and 1890s. And for Arthur Morgan not to have a political identity, like a partisan identity, would have been ridiculous. This would totally have, been unavoidable in this period. And actually, in my class, we debated for quite some time what party Arthur would have voted for, and we decided that he would probably have been a populist. He was critical of big business and sort of, Eastern powers, but he also has this really important, like, anti-racist backbone, because he's very critical of, racial hierarchy in America, which is really awesome how the game showcases those critical perspectives. And not all populists were anti-racist. In fact, many of them were white supremacists, unfortunately. But some of them were critical of that too. So Arthur would have been a sort of, like, um, a white populist who is critical of Jim Crow and kind of the systems of racial hierarchy that were coming into place.
Let's talk a little bit about Jim Crow, because I suppose that, and of course, me not being American, I was not aware of this until I read the book. And the Jim Crow
Yeah,
was actually not, and I think a lot of people may not be aware of this, that Jim Crow was actually not a real person. Let's discuss the Jim Crow law a little bit, and how, because
yeah.
it was came from all of all places, it came from a play about a fictional character. So let's talk about how this came about.
Yeah, sure thing. Right. So here's another reminder that Red Dead Redemption 2 is just as much a Southern as it is a Western. And I think this doesn't get acknowledged enough because, West sells. And of course, the marketing materials for the game and then almost every
It's a
review of
Wild
the
South
game.
game.
Well, the South was really wild in this period. That's the thing. It's just that's not a familiar story to Americans nowadays. And the West is something that's people know what to expect, or they think they know what to expect. But what really energized me and excited me about Red Dead 2, and really what convinced me to teach a class on it and then write a book on it, was how much time is spent in the Deep South. In Lemoyne, especially the state that's probably some sort of combination of Louisiana and Mississippi. And obviously, Saint Denis, the main city in Lemoyne, is supposed to be New Orleans. I think that's fairly obvious. Um, but I thought that was really interesting because the 1890s, when the game is set, is a really crucial turning point in Southern history. And it's one that people are much less familiar with. I think when folks think of, pivotal decades in Southern history, they think about the 1860s, the Civil War, or the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement. And the 1890s, I would say, are third place. They win a bronze medal because this is a really important decade when Southern society really changes very, very rapidly. And one of the things that happens during the 1890s is that formalized systematic racial segregation gets put into place for the first time. And that's what we call Jim Crow, right? So Jim Crow was not a real person, but it's a minstrelsy character. Minstrelsy is this really strange and very embarrassing, ultimately, form of pop culture, popular music, where white actors would wear blackface, where they'd use burnt cork to darken their features to appear as if they looked African American, and then they would put on these shows that basically made fun out of Black culture and Black people in general, right? So these were very popular in the early 1800s, 1820s, 30s, 40s, not just in the South, but everywhere in the U.S., right? This was like a national obsession. In many ways, it's America's first pop music genre, which is not something most people are proud of, nor should they be, to be sure. But yeah, Jim Crow was one of these characters in the minstrelsy shows. And then in the early 1900s, that name is then applied to the system of sort of racial control that's being put into place in the South. So these are the rules that establish, separate bathrooms, separate drinking fountains, separate entrances to movie theaters, schools, of course, for white and black children separately. This entire regime, it has some early origins after the Civil War, but it is not put into place fully until the 1890s. And the reason why is that the 1890s is this decade of tremendous white backlash. It's a decade when white Southerners felt that they were losing control over Southern society. And it's when they saw African Americans, doing better, advancing economically and materially, kind of doing better in the creature comforts of life. And when African Americans could still vote in large numbers. So there's this big backlash in the 1890s to try to reestablish forceful white control over the South, especially rich white control, because class matters a lot here. It's the wealthy white Southerners who want to make sure that poor white Southerners don't build any kind of alliance with their black neighbors. This was something that terrified a lot of the elite in the South. So in order to do that, they passed these laws that begin in the 1890s and impose segregation. All right, so one of the funny things that I did with my class is that we walked around in the city of Saint Denis, this New Orleans in Red Dead Redemption 2, and what we were looking for were visual markers of segregation, right? Those signs that would say for white, for colored, that would have been seen on some, waiting rooms, bathrooms, all sorts of public spaces within the South. So we walk around the city and we try to find, well, does the game depict that? And the answer is no, they don't. They don't show them anywhere. And then we wonder, was that realistic or not? And it turns out that the game is half right and half wrong because some places would have been segregated in 1899, like the long haul train station, right? Like the train station that carries you out of the city, not the city trolleys, but the long haul rail. That would very much have been segregated because Louisiana passes a law in 1890 called the Separate Car Act, which legislates exactly that law. But then other things would not have been. Like the city trolley in New Orleans was not segregated in 1899. It would only come in 1902, soon thereafter, that segregation came to this sort of intercity rail within the city. So that is kind of interesting, right? So in many ways, this is a missed opportunity because the epilogue of Red Dead Redemption 2, in which you play as John Marston in 1906 or 1907, I can't remember off the top of my head. You can
Just 6
return
years
to
later, I think it's 7 years later.
yeah, exactly. So you can return to Saint Denis, and some things have changed, right? Like the developers clearly shifted the city over that time, but the landscape of racial segregation is exactly the same in that there's nothing anywhere. And that by 1906, that would have been totally wrong because by 1906, New Orleans was thoroughly segregated. Many of these laws had just come in the last few years. So the game does drop the ball there, right? They had an opportunity to explore the
However,
ways that
if I
public space
may
are shifted.
if I
Yeah.
may intervene again, there is if you go to the right place at the right time. I don't remember where in the city. You do find a black NPC that's being chased by a copper in the game, and he did apparently no. I don't remember exactly. There was a racial reason
Hmm.
behind, so you do see some
No, I didn't
racial
notice that. I
things.
mean,
I
but
don't
that's one
remember
thing. I mean,
exactly where. I mean, I tried to send you a
yeah.
link to this in
Yeah, please
the
do. I
recording,
didn't know
but
that.
there is one place in the game city where you see a cop chasing a black NPC that for no reason and end up killing him. And you have also have the choice. I do believe you have a
Hmm.
choice to intervene and kill the cop as well.
Right. Well, yeah, so I mean that is interesting, but police, oppression of black peoples is not the same as systematic racial
Mm.
segregation,
Yeah.
right? I mean they're interlinked at times, to be sure. Certainly in the convict lease system, the sort of chain gang
Mm.
system that was really common in New Orleans in the same time period of black convicts being arrested for like the most minor offenses and then being forced to do unpaid labor for weeks, if not months, on the city's streets. That was a major component, right? So the game gestures toward like chain gangs. You
Mm,
know, there's multiple instances when you run into these, convicts that are
mm,
clad in striped uniforms.
yeah.
So the game again gestures toward these big topics in Southern history. But as I found it, there were, again, I counted them up because I was quite interested. There were a lot more white convicts in the game than there were
Mm,
black convicts. And that was totally unrealistic because like
mm,
80 to 90% of Southern chain gangs were African American. Whites were a small minority, never a majority in these states.
mm. Another thing, of course, that is you can find if you go in the evening, either as John Marston or Arthur Morgan, is of course the Ku Klux Klan, which is having a meeting near roads. And let's talk a little bit about the Ku Klux Klan as well. And as I point out, it's not entirely historical accurate that they are a thing in this era.
Yeah, well, the Ku Klux Klan very much was a thing after the Civil War. And in fact, they're founded in the state
Mm,
that I live in Tennessee. But the timing is the problem in the game, right? Because the game is, of course, set in 1899, but you would not have found the Klan actively organizing or out in the open or really existing at all in many states because the Klan is really driven, it's really stamped out in the South by 1872 and 1873. There's a huge crackdown against their activities,
And
even though,
if I may, as well, I'm
yeah.
really glad that you actually call them for what they are, terrorists and not just white supremacists, because I haven't found, at least even today, when you still saw the race riots in the UK, if I made that comparison, that when they didn't call them terrorists, just far right wing, because it were very much where the riots in the UK, they very much were terrorism towards other minorities in the UK. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. The events that happened maybe a month ago I think, but it's where there are even newspapers today that are reluctant to call because terrorism apparently just are an Arab monopoly, right? So yeah, I really appreciate that you actually called them the Ku Klux Klan for what they were, terrorists.
Yeah, I mean, they weren't numerous enough
Yeah.
to achieve their goals. Politically, like at the voting booth, they were never going to win just by their numbers alone. So they relied upon terror, right? They wanted to
Mm.
frighten people away from casting votes or from, joining the Republican Party, especially. So yeah, they were. I mean, I think they would have embraced that. I don't think that word was in frequent
Yeah.
use in the late, the 1860s and 70s, but I don't think they would have been uncomfortable with it, like they would see themselves as, terror in the name of white supremacy, right? This was like their agenda from the very beginning.
Mm. Another thing, of course, that we see in Saint Denis, and one of the villains against the Vanderline Gang is, of course, Angelo Bronte, who ends up
Yeah,
taking up Jack and John Marston's son. So let's talk a
right.
little bit about the whether, and you, as you pointed out, there weren't too much. There were, of course, Italians in Saint Denis, but they weren't as the present as we see them in the game. So let's talk a little bit about the real
Yeah.
immigration and, of course, Italian presence in New Orleans. Of course, I was about to say Saint Denis, but of course, in real life, it's New Orleans. So let's talk a little bit about the
Right.
history of Italian presence and migration in the city. And
Yeah.
then I want to talk about as well because we hear a lot of, as you say, as you know, New Orleans used to be a French colony. So we're still by 1899, we're a lot of French presence with French accent, as we hear in the game. There's a lot of French
Mhm.
presence there. Whereas by the time of 1899, there's still a lot of French present in Saint Denis.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of Americans today, or people around the world who are just curious about the United States, might be surprised to learn that there was a greater proportion of immigrants within the population in 1900 or 1910 than there are today. Today, you know, a lot of Americans today feel like, oh, there's never been so many immigrants in the United States.
Mm,
And yes, it is true numerically that there's a greater number of immigrants around today than ever before, in part because there's just more people in general around in the U.S. today.
mm,
But proportionally, in 1900, there were more immigrants, right? So in that time period, it was about 1900 census, I think it was about
mm,
13.6% of the population was born outside of the US. And in 2020, it was only about 13%, right? So it's slightly higher in 1900. Of course, the immigrants back then come from very different places than they do today, right? Today, it's primarily, you know, Latin America and Asia and Africa to some regard. But in 1900, the largest immigrant groups were Ireland and Germany and Russia and Italy and other countries, particularly in Southern and Eastern Europe.
mm,
And just like is true today, there was a lot of hostility and anxiety among native born whites about these new groups. You know, there was a lot of demonizing of
mm,
Catholic and Jewish and working class immigrants in the US, really often using the same kind of language that people like Donald Trump and others today use to describe, you know, Mexicans or Guatemalans, which is an interesting parallel. So our current dilemmas look a little different, but they're not completely removed from
mm,
what came, you know, a century and some decades earlier. So the game provides an interesting opportunity to examine this question of immigration because it showcases this really large population of not just Italians, but Sicilians in particular, right? This island in the south of Italy. It shows that, you know, Saint Denis, this fictional game city, was home to a lot of Sicilian immigrants and that they were very powerful immigrants. Of course, because Angelo Bronte, this kind of mob boss, is the guy who runs Saint Denis, right? He is the sort of puppet master in the shadows who makes all the big calls about what happens in the city. How does that hold up? Well, it's like, again, half right, half wrong. Yeah, there were a lot of Sicilians, especially in New Orleans, which is quite interesting. I mean, not there were lots of Italians in general in New Orleans, um, but the large majority of them were from Sicily, which was not the case across the whole U.S. But about 90% of the Italians in New Orleans in 1900 were from Sicily, right? So that's interesting that the game captures that. And again, it goes to show that the developers, they clearly did some research. You know, they must have picked up books. Certainly they watched movies, but they also must have picked up some good books about this time period. But, you know, half of the representation is also problematic and probably inaccurate because though there were lots of rumors about Italian organized crime in New Orleans and nationally, many of those rumors were hollow. Most of them were imagined due to these hostilities and nativism that often was seen in American culture. So the idea that Sicilians were the ones running New Orleans in 1899 is totally bizarre. In fact, the vast majority of Sicilians who lived in that city were humble working class people who were much more likely to be the victims rather than victimizers of native born residents. And New Orleans is fascinating too because there's a perfect example of this in 1891, so 8 years before the game is set. A large native white mob actually lynches 11 Sicilians in front of the courthouse in New Orleans under because of unfounded suspicions that they had murdered the police chief earlier that year. So this is one of the very worst mass lynchings in American history, right? 11 people are killed at this one event, all Sicilian immigrants which leads to a tremendous backlash internationally, right? That Italy's leadership is like, you know, very much enraged by this and pushes the U.S. on the international stage to, you know, apologize and make amends for this. And what's really intriguing is that a year later, in
mm,
1892, the U.S. declares the very first Columbus Day ever, which was halfway a recognition of the 400-year anniversary of 1492, but just as much a sort of apology to the Italians, because Columbus Day was meant not just to celebrate Columbus, but to celebrate the contributions of Italians to American society.
Mm,
So this was meant to sort of be an apology for the absurd violence that had taken place in New Orleans in just a year earlier.
mm.
So Red Dead Redemption 2 has this moment to showcase, this kind of violent backlash against Italian immigrants, but instead it just puts them on top and, kind of plays to these imagined
Stereotype in a
fears.
way.
Yeah, exactly, of the Italian mafia and all that. And I'm not saying there was no organized crime with Italian immigrants anywhere in the US. I mean, that would be false too. There certainly was some in some cities, but New Orleans was not the place to demonstrate that.
Mm. You brought me nicely into the next topic because you mentioned lynching, and as it's right about in the book, there is some mention of lynching in by some of the characters, such as Lenny, for example, the black gang member. So
Yeah,
let's talk about lynching and how that came to be. And it's not like it's not a
right.
presence in the game, but let's you bring
It's
it up so
hinted
in the
at.
book, so it's into that. So let's talk a little
Yeah.
bit about how lynching, perhaps maybe it should. I don't know if it should have been in the game, perhaps, but let's talk a little bit about the history of lynching
Yeah.
and what
Well,
actually lynching
so
is.
I love the Lenny Summers character in the game.
Lenny!
Lenny, not just because of his drinking episode with Arthur, but because he's this really nuanced and fascinating character, right? So he's the
Mm,
son of enslaved parents, right? He was born to folks who had been previously enslaved. He's a Southerner himself, but he, of course, was living in the West with the gang previously, but then ends up reluctantly returning to Lemoyne because the gang has no other options, right? So there's a lot of commentary that Lenny provides, whether it's in camp or riding on missions with Arthur, where he describes, his sort of hesitation of being a black man in the midst, not just of the South, but the South in this particular moment as it's changing so rapidly in the 1890s. And so yeah, so Lenny makes this reference, that white Southerners would quote make visits in the night. Right, something he says, like
yeah.
a sort of backlash that
And
happens
this
to
might
folks
easily,
who,
it certainly didn't surpass me, my tiny brain. So this might go way over the head of some, but for you, it actually
yeah,
kind of gave you the idea of what was actually going on. But like I said, it may actually
yeah, it
go way
hints at
past.
it. The,
For some people like me, it went way over my head what it actually meant.
right. Yeah, so that in large part my book is about, filling in those gaps because the game raises these topics but never fully explains them. But yeah, so there's another moment in the game too that I think really speaks to this, which is this NPC named Dr. Renault, who you encounter in Rhodes. And, Arthur's walking around and this black doctor is sitting there. He's really distraught. He just got robbed of his medicine wagon by a bunch of white men who accused him of undercutting their own business, which was providing the same sort of service. And in this exchange, the doctor hints actually that getting his wagon stolen was about the best thing that could have happened because what the men threatened him with was so much worse, right? The
Yeah.
crucifixion, defenestration, like all these horrific bodily harms that could have been done to him. The doctor is like thankful that he avoided that. And what that is a reference to lynching, to this process of mob violence against black men in particular, which was really coming to a crescendo. And in fact, the 1890s are the bloodiest decade of lynching in American history. They claim more victims in that decade than in any other decade before or after. So even though the game doesn't like explicitly feature a lynching, and I probably think it's wise that they don't, because this is, of course, one of the most painful and bitter moments in American history, and it's very difficult to do this respectfully in any game, but especially in a game that gives players such liberties. I think Rockstar had to tiptoe around this
Yeah.
And I think they were smart to do so in many ways. But because the game references this, I thought, well, it's really important that we uh, have a chapter of the book, and of course, a class in my undergraduate course that talks about, well, what is lynching really, and why was it happening, and why was it coming to the climax in the 1890s? And it all comes back to that original argument that I made that the 1890s is this tremendous moment of white backlash.
Mm.
That it's a campaign of terror, not unlike the Ku Klux Klan. Lynching is not about eliminating Black Southerners. It's not about genocide. It is about terror. Most white Southerners did not want Black Southerners to leave the region. They wanted their labor. They wanted their cheap labor above all, but they want them to remain, quote unquote, in their place, right? They don't want to rock the boat. They want to make sure that African Americans don't question the fundamental precept of white supremacy. And this sporadic violence, which would actually get quite frequent at times, and would claim thousands of victims over the course of several decades, was a way that white Southerners sought to instill this terror in Black Americans, right? The threat of lynching could be around every corner, just like the doctor, Dr. Renault, in the game learns firsthand.
Mm. Now, of course, the next topic I want to talk about is the Native American War of Independence. And as you point out, it's a little bit out of place, but where there any struggling tribes but in this era that actually kind of try to fight the system, as you see in the game that's trying to stay as the stated way of life in the 1899 as we see in the game, or is this not really realistic? Where let's
Right.
talk and let's talk a little bit about the Native American War of Independence.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you call it a war of independence. That's a term we usually describe the American nation's war against the British, things like that. But I think there's a grain of truth to it because over centuries, Native people resisted
Hmm.
profoundly, Eastern white-led projects to take their land or to
To quote,
incorporate
like
them.
say, quote unquote, civilize them.
Exactly, right. So there's a very long story of resistance and pushback from that. And there are countless examples of violent warfare between Native peoples and the US Army in particular, many of which has been very made famous in Western mythology, right? With things like the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, among others, right? So there's lots of evidence that because Red Dead Redemption 2 showcases, the Wapiti at war with the military in this very dramatic and bloody standoff. That would have made a lot of sense in the 1850s, 1860s, or even the 1870s. But by 1899, that was not taking place anymore. I'm not saying there's not
Like you said,
native resistance.
where the some resistance still of like we see in the game, like the Wapiti tribe, or whether not, well, was that kind of like, of course, kind of get why they were in there, but where the some of
Yeah.
this game.
Here's the thing. So like and I say this in the book multiple times, I really think Rockstar wanted to make a game about the early 1870s
Mm,
because so many of the topics in the game would make so much sense in like 1872, whether you're going hunting bison,
mm,
encountering the Klan, seeing the Pinkertons chasing Western outlaws, all that would make so much sense in 1871, but it really makes very little sense in 1899. And I know that they needed to set the second game so that you could have John Marston alive in the prequel, right? Because John Marston's,
mm.
I don't know, in his 30s or maybe early 40s in Red Dead Redemption 1, the original one set in 1911. So if they went back to 1871, he would have been an infant. So that wouldn't work by their, in the Red Dead universe. But I really wish they had actually made a game about the early 1870s and just said it's set in 1871 rather than trying to force this square peg into a round hole of 1899.
Mm.
So that's my kind of view on it, because there's a lot of topics, again, that would make a lot of sense in the 70s, but not in 99.
Mm. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Pinkertons because they are very much another. There are many villains in the game, and one of them is of course the famous Pinkerton agency, who famously, of course, tried to sue Rockstar because of their representation in the game. So let's talk a little bit about the real Pinkerton. And they seem to be, from what I understand from your book, they seem to be fairly accurately described. Of course, most famously in real life, they went after Jesse James and his gang and a famous shootout in his own home where his mother and his son dies. His mother loses her arm, but his son
Right.
dies. So let's talk a little bit about the real historical Pinkerton of the
Yeah.
real
Well, so the
Wild West.
the Pinkertons are fascinating because they're like pretty much the only institution in Red Dead Redemption 2 that is not fictionalized, right? The names of all the places are made up, the names of all the people are made up, right? There was no Leviticus Cornwall, there was no state of New Austin, but there was very much a real agency called the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which did operate in the decades after the Civil War in the United States. And as you mentioned, Erland, that gets them in Rockstar and their parent company, Take-Two, in a little bit of trouble, or at least the threat of trouble, because the current day Pinkerton Consulting Agency, which is actually owned by a Swedish company, Securitas, decides to sue Take-Two, saying that you are smearing our legacy, you're shaming this group for something that they never were,
They
that they
didn't
were
though. They didn't.
inaccurately representing them. Now, this court case goes nowhere, in part because they're largely wrong, in that the Pinkertons very much were the hired guns of big business in the late 19th century. But that doesn't mean that Rockstar's portrayal of the Pinkertons is completely accurate either, because by the 1890s, when the game is set, the Pinkertons are really primarily invested in industrial labor disputes, much more so than chasing bandits. I'm not saying they didn't chase any bandits back then, but they're really an institution that was wrapped up with breaking up labor unions, intervening on the part of big businesses, such as in the Homestead strike in Pennsylvania, and trying to, put workers into their place and keep them from rocking the boat economically. So the Pinkertons really change over time, especially as the founder, Alan Pinkerton, after he passes away and turns his company over to his sons. His sons take the business in a direction that would have been quite, unexpected. And, um, I think Alan Pinkerton would have been very unhappy to see what the agency had become by the 1890s, to be sure, because he's a guy who has idealistic views of the world. The original Alan Pinkerton, the founder.
Let's talk a little bit about Alan Pinkerton's background as well, because it's really fascinating. He's kind of a rags to riches story in a way.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, he's very similar to Andrew Carnegie in that both Carnegie and Pinkerton, they're both born in Scotland. They're both born to pretty poor, at least, lower middle class families. And they were both Chartists. And Chartists was this sort of, grassroots working class political movement in England in the not just all England, the entire United Kingdom, in the 1830s and 1840s. And both of them leave their homelands because of the trouble that came along with this. There's a lot of repression and backlash by the British government, and both of them, both Carnegie and Pinkerton, become very rich, though Carnegie a lot richer than Pinkerton, to be sure. But yeah, Pinkerton moves to Illinois. He moves to Chicago, and he becomes involved in investigations and in crime investigations, but not as a police officer. He's always kind of working with law enforcement, but he's not law enforcement himself. He is a private, the Pinkerton agency was private. They were not run by the government in any way whatsoever. And they start off by, sort of protecting wagon trains, like express companies, like the American Express Company, for example, the Wells Fargo Express Company, as they're transferring wealth, usually gold, across large distances. But then they get more into chasing outlaws and bandits in the 1860s and 1870s, especially. And most of the big showdowns with Pinkerton and the Jesse James crew take place in the middle of the 1870s. And so this is when those, these moments that clearly inspired Red Dead
Getting back
Redemption
in the
2 are taking place.
1870s.
Yeah, again, I'm not saying that there were no more outlaws by the 1890s, but there were definitely fewer than there were in the kind of James Younger gang era.
Mm. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, of course, is Hannesburg, which is a coal mining town. And I wanted to, because it's a fairly good representation, because there were real towns like this. There were towns where So let's talk a little bit about how Annesburg works and the history behind. Again, of course, it's owned by Leviticus Cornwall as well in the game. So let's talk about the real towns of Annesburg as well.
Yeah, so I think most players of Red Dead Redemption 2 would acknowledge that the game covers the real life West, the real life Deep South, and of course the real life Caribbean to some extent with Guarma.
Mm.
But I don't think everyone realizes that the game was trying to depict Southern Appalachia, right? The Southern mountains, places like West Virginia, Eastern Tennessee, Western North Carolina. But I see the sort of the southeastern, well, on the map, it's the northeastern part of the map, Annisburg, Butcher Creek, these areas in, I guess it's New Hanover, I want to say.
I
Um,
think so. I think so.
yeah, exactly. That's to me, the developers are really trying to capture Appalachia. And this is actually where I live, right? So I live in Eastern Tennessee.
And
It's very much
please,
part of the
if,
Southern
if,
Mountains.
if I may, please explain what is Appalachia, as some people may not be familiar with that.
Yeah, so it's named after a mountain range, the Appalachian Mountains, which are incredibly long. They go all the way from Georgia, basically, up to Maine. So they're like the mountain range on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And in the 1890s, folks began calling the southern part of this region Appalachia. Like they just called it that name after the mountain range. And when they called it that, they also imagined certain characteristics to describe this region. They imagined the region as poor, as backward, as isolated, as sort of cut off from the progress of the
It
rest
was
of the
kind of
country.
a 19th century meme in a way.
Yeah, totally. It was a 19th century meme, and it really starts in the 1890s above all. So I spent a lot of time in the book exploring this one guy, William Goodell Frost, who probably had more influence than anyone else in defining Appalachia as a place. And of course, it's a definition that's stuck around for a lot longer. I mean, the current vice presidential candidate for president, Donald Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, he's built his entire career on this book about Appalachia. Well, he thinks it's about Appalachia. I don't think it actually says much about the Southern Mountains
Of
personally,
course it does.
but this book, Hillbilly Elegy, right? It's about Appalachia, and that's what the hillbilly, the phrase comes from the association with this region. So I think that Rockstar was trying to capture
He's a bit of a
Appalachia at
hillbilly
this
though,
moment.
Vance.
Say it again.
He's a bit of a hillbilly type though, Vance.
Well, that's a very loaded phrase, hillbilly, right? So in the book, I spent a lot of time exploring where that stereotype comes from, and why it was adopted and what it was meant to say. Um, I mean, J.D. Vance has like a degree from Yale or whatever, some Ivy League, Northeastern school. So that is, cuts against the hillbilly myth as it exists. But ultimately, I'm not here to talk about 21st
That's
century
that's fair
politics. I'm
enough.
here to talk about
That's fair
19th
enough.
century politics. But so, yeah, so the Rockstar's depiction of Appalachia has this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character. Like it's this very yin yang inverse, sort of model of it, in that on face value, Rockstar's depiction of this of Southern Appalachia is profoundly stereotypical, right? It relies on a lot of old cliches, including, these bearded, toothless, uneducated, backward, um, sort of hillbillies. And in fact, the gang uses this word hillbilly quite a bit. Dutch, especially, will use this word left and right, when in fact it was not in very common usage at all in 1899, which is quite intriguing. But so the game like reproduces a lot of old stereotypes about rural white Southern mountain people, which of course Rockstar has a very long history of doing. I mean, I
And
remember the original Grand Theft Auto games, they all do this, or it's always safe to make fun out of rural white Southern poor people.
and if I
And
may, as well as you point out in the book, so far until this chapter, Rockstar has been fairly good at avoiding stereotypes.
yeah,
It's just
right.
until this chapter, when we come to Annesburg and the Appalachia, that they really begin to use stereotypes again. So it's a
I
choice.
think
Choice.
I think that's not an accident. I think it's because there's still a sense in the US that making fun out of poor rural white Southern, especially mountain people, is like acceptable, right? That this is okay. This is fair game. This is a group that's always okay to make fun out of. And I really don't agree with that personally. I think it's really dicey to do that, especially given the history of this region and um, why these stereotypes come around in the first place. Because a lot of them are invented. They're not real. They're not actually rooted in history. Um, so so the game recycles and reproduces a lot of these stereotypes very frequently. But there's this sort of other side to it too, because even while they advance this, stereotype of the isolated, toothless, shoeless mountain man,
Mm.
the game also acknowledges that this region is being transformed really rapidly by big outside corporations. And here we have the sort of logging and mining operations of um, Leviticus Cornwall and his what is it called? Jameson Coal Mining Company in Annisburg, which cuts against this view that people in Appalachia are poor because they're isolated, when in fact it shows that well, this region's actually not isolated at all. It's really incorporated within the national economy,
So
but
it's a
it's
product
very
of capitalism.
unevenly.
It's a product of capitalism that made them poor.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what the hillbilly mythology denies. The sort of hillbilly myth says, the people of the southern mountains are poor because they're isolated and disconnected. But in reality, they're poor because they're very unevenly connected. They're very unevenly exploited within the national economy because, a lot of the forest and mountain sides of this region are torn apart and cut down in order to enrich large northeastern corporations who are coming in at the very same time. So that, really problematizes the mythology of the, trapped in amber hillbilly who's just living as his ancestors always had. Well, that's not actually true. So in the book, I spent a lot of time on the history of Appalachia and how it changes after the Civil War with the arrival of these large external corporations who are very hungry for the natural resources that existed in this region.
Hmm. Now, before we go on to the epilogue, and we don't spend a whole deal in the book about the epilogues, but before we do this, and I don't believe you have a chapter on this either, let's talk a little bit about bounty hunting, of course, in the game and versus real life.
Yeah, Erland, I will confess, I don't actually know a ton about bounty hunting. It's not a topic that I explored all that much.
That's
I'm
fair
sure
enough.
it must have some rooting in reality, but I don't, I actually have not read any good books or articles about that
That's
practice.
fair
So
enough.
I'm gonna draw a blank on that one.
That's fair enough. But in the epilogue, I want to focus on John Marston's dream about owning a farm, and of course we see him do a lot of farm work in the first few missions. But
Hmm.
In the later on, as we progress, we do see him go into this as uncle who has famously lumbago. He suggests that he might buy a finished house, a finished kind of IKEA house in a way. So
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit about the idea in the Rockstar game that you can try to buy for lack of better words, IKEA house that you can just kind of build from a handbook in a way. Was there such a thing as we see in John
Oh
Mark
yeah.
2?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's so funny actually. The house that I live in in Tennessee, it was built in 1889. So, 10 years before Red Dead Redemption 2 was set. And it was built from a mail order blueprint. It was, in the Sears and Roebuck catalog, you could buy blueprints for houses that have, precise ways to cut wood and, basically follow the directions and build a house that'll look just like this one. And as a result, there's like lots of copies of my house across my city and even as far away as the Philippines, which is pretty crazy to think about, in part because of American colonialism over in the Philippines. But so yeah, you'd get sort of built to order kits and directions certainly that would have been possible to reassemble. I mean, I think the game, because building a house is actually a lot harder than
Yeah,
how John Marston and
you still
crew
have to
makes it
build
look.
it.
You still, there was a lot of planning that went into it. But I think that the basic idea that you could order plans and perhaps pre-cut wood for a house would not have been particularly unrealistic in 1906 when it takes place.
Another thing I want to ask about is, of course, and again, uncles that get kidnapped by these. And there is a bounty mission as well on this. Is this famous Skinner brothers in the episode? Was the gangs like these Skinner brothers? What is brutal savages that dropped you or burned you alive, or well, as you see, with them trying to burn his skin off when they put him on the fire, and all these brutal methods that he uses with the machete and everything. Now, was there such
Right.
gangs as Skinner Brothers in the game?
Yeah, so I didn't think too much about the Skinner brothers in depth, because I mean there were all sorts of psychotic,
Hmm.
horrific
That's fair
criminals
enough.
in the US then as today, right? Were they sort of representative of a larger trend? I don't think so. But what I did spend a lot of time thinking about is the Murphy Brood, right? So the Murphy Brood is that Southern Appalachian mountain,
Hmm.
gang that you come up to, come head to head with, and they also are portrayed as these, barbaric,
Yeah.
people who delight and thrill in pain and torture and sadism. And that I largely see as being pulled from these stereotypes of Appalachia, because a lot of the stereotype of Appalachia, not only is it saying that, oh, these people are poor and backward and isolated, but that they can be horrifically violent,
Hmm.
really cruelly violent. And lots of different American pop cultural productions have built on this. Probably the most famous one is a 1972 movie called Deliverance. If you haven't seen it, you might just want to watch it out of curiosity. It's not a very good movie, but it was very influential. And it's set in the 1970s. It's not historical at all, but it's about these middle class guys from Atlanta, from the big city, who go out into the southern mountains to go camping or fishing or whatever, and they get terrorized by, basically the Murphy
Hmm.
brood, like these cackling good old boys who, are, I mean, they're horrific, right? They're like the Skinner brothers personified. And that's really made up. I mean, that's drawing on these, hollow stereotypes of Appalachia as these, awful, brutal, nasty individuals. And so I think that that's drawn more from mythology than from history. But you could look into it. I didn't want the book to be a sort of like close focus on like, oh, here's someone from the game, here's the real world
Yeah.
equivalent, because I wanted to think more about kind of big dilemmas, like
Yeah.
the big, issues of the day. Which the game can help us get at, but I think looking just at the people and close equivalents can
Hmm.
be a little navel gazing
Yeah.
in the perspective.
Hmm. Overall, what are your final thoughts? I mean, you kind of expressed it already, but what are your final thoughts on the game and as a historical piece? And how do you think people can write more about historical games? Because, like I said in the beginning, I think people absolutely should write more about, say, for example, the Assassin's Creed genre has several games that are set in historical settings, and especially the third one, for example, in the American War of Independence, I think. And you have Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is set in, let's say, ancient Greece, and you have Ghost of Tsushima, who is set in medieval Japan. And do you think that there should be more gay books like yours, kind of exploring all these historical
Yeah.
games? And do you think there is a, I think it's obviously there seems to be a market for it with your book. I think there's clearly an opportunity here to explore actually some historical facts from these games.
Yeah, no, I do think that there should be more books like this, and I hope to write more of them myself,
Mm.
to be sure, though I have limited expertise. I'm really a specialist at modern America, not at ancient Greece, so I won't be the
I
one
mean,
writing
that
about
was just an
Assassin's
example.
Creed.
That
I
was just
know.
an example, you know.
Exactly, exactly. No, I've played Ghost of Tsushima and I really enjoyed it, but I'm not a specialist at,
Mm.
medieval Japanese history, so I'm not the person to write that book either. But I think my final thought is that video games can be really powerful learning tools if they're accompanied by serious historical content that, kind of sympathizes with the game, but then looks to expand it outward.
Mm.
I think that most historical video games on their own are not going to teach you all that much, nuanced history. But if they get you excited and passionate about something, I'd like to see more professional historians like myself reach out and kind of meet people where they are, build on that passion and curiosity that they have, and then take them to new places. I mean, that was really the mission behind my book, Red Dead's History, and I hope to do more of it in the future as well. But yeah, I mean, I think video games, they're not going away. They're not a
Mm.
fad. They are here to stay for good or ill, and that historians and teachers in general should make good use of them, not by celebrating them as, educational tools on their own, because most of them are not, but as a starting point to begin opening conversations about big historical topics. So I think that there's a lot of possibility moving forward. And I'm not alone. I mean, there's lots of other folks with history PhDs who are using these games in their teaching, but I think we could do more of it, and it would not be a problem.
I think that's a wonderful message, and I think you achieved tremendously well with your book, the real history behind Red Dead Redemption. Of course, before you go, do you have anything you want to promote, any links you want me to put in the description below, and where can people find your book if they want to read more? And of course, I should say, if you are on Audible, their book, of course, is available there, and it's narrated by the Arthur Morgan himself, which you should absolutely check out. And of course, you can buy a physical copy as well. And where can people find your book if they want to read books more, read a book after listening to this episode? And where's your social media and where can people find you if they have further questions from this episode?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, include any information about the audiobook to be sure. You can share my social media accounts because I also use Instagram and TikTok as well. And yeah, this has been really fun. Erlend, I appreciate your questions and you reading the book so closely. And I hope that folks enjoy listening to the episode.
I hope so too. Thank you so much for finding. So thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you. This has been Well That Aged Well. You can find us on social media under Well That Aged Well on Twitter and Instagram. So and you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts. If you are on Spotify, please rate us 5 stars. That would be very nice. And leave a comment. You can do that now as well. So that would be very nice if you enjoyed this episode. And of course, we are on Apple Podcast. Consider writing a review, and I will try to read it up on the podcast if I find it. If you're on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. And check out some other episodes we have. We have more on the Wild West as well. You can, of course, check out other topics. We are a weekly podcast, so please like, share, and subscribe. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.